I begin immediately. It's wonderful that you're still here. It's a very generous act. I will perhaps say idea was to, with Tiana, we discussed the idea of bringing back on stage the moderators that could. Thank you, Charlotte, for making this effort for us. And go back to the panels and see them from a different perspective. I think we were exposed this afternoon to the labor of thinking. We've been just asked the question, what the work of Rebecca Horn does. For sure, it makes feeling, it generates feeling, but we learn that it makes thinking. And we were exposed to beautiful thinking this afternoon. And therefore, perhaps the first question we can ask Henrik will be, your panel was extremely rich. There were different questions that were touched upon. Singularity was a word that stays with me somehow. That was kind of interesting word. Then it's a transgressive singularity because obviously there are bodies, and bodies are beautifully at the center of the show through films. There's a specific relation to art history. There was a question of logic of sensation. So how will you go back to the preoccupation you've been working on preparing this panel after the other one? So how do you see the whole discussion?
Thank you, Andrea, for starting us off a little bit. And yeah, I mean, still like processing a little bit as well, so bear with me. But I think, the way that I go back to what we were talking about this morning or in the early afternoon, but also in my mind to go back to the show in so many ways, because I think what we've seen in all the, let's say, discussions is truly an expanse of language for me to talk about this sort of our artist work. And one of the things that, maybe just to stay a bit sort of close to what I do, I make sort of exhibitions as well. And when I make an exhibition of a more historical sort of artist, such as this one, it's always a sort of a question that I have on my mind, like how does a young artist meet this work? Of course, we make sort of exhibitions for all kinds of sort of our audiences, and it needs to sort of educate, it needs to open up, sort of an exhibition needs to do a lot of things. But, I think of how a young artist actually kind of steps into this exhibition and starts thinking about work that, on one hand is like really situated in its time, I think. And that's also what I think this morning we were speaking a bit about, like, how does she sort of, let's say, arrive at the body, but also like the body machine and the expanse of the body. On the one hand, in a very singular way, I think, again, to highlight that word. On the other hand, I think, as the second sort of session also showed, singular, yes, but in dialogue with a lot of mostly female sort of artists at the time, actually. So singularity and not at the same time. But back to my point is that, yes, situated in its time, but also sort of a pioneering form in so many ways, because, and that's what the second and sort of the third session really did for me in that sense, is to bring language that feels very much, let's say, of the now to this work, to understand how a body of work like this sort of relates to non-human sort of actors, relates to sort of ecology, sort of relates to the possibility of a machine having a life of its own, relates to the possibility of a lot of things that I think sort of our artists now are thinking through in an urgent manner more often than not, and try to understand sort of the politics of that. So this is a little bit the tour of the show that I'm doing over and over in my head with the gift of the language that comes from, everything we've heard. So I can return to it later, but that's what I have to say for now.
Thank you. This is very enriching, and the soul also was a very interesting point. It's beautifully you mentioned that, and the question of the language. Charlotte, your panel was absolutely unexpected in my experience. I didn't expect this direction, so there were questions of violence that were raised, toxicity, violence, but I also was touched by this opening a perspective in Rebecca Horn works that has to do with criticality, I mean, institutional critique. That's just my notes, but how would you see the discussion you had, maybe in light of what you had before and what you had after?
Okay, the notion of institutional critique, that's not something that I was really thinking about, so this I would need some more time to think about. I guess what really stays with me from our panel, I mean, Sarah, you can correct or say further what you thought, but were the different ways of rethinking her practice and the many ways that still need also to be discussed. And so maybe there's a sort of institutional critique that was addressed in our panel that was more to do with art history or how institutions have framed her work so far. So, for instance, this invitation by Amanda Caccia to really rethink deeply and thoroughly Horn's work through the lens of disability, bringing her practice in conversation with younger artists who identify this as disabled, and really thinking that through beyond just this repeated idea that she was staying at the sanatorium, but really putting more pressure on the question. And also related to a rethinking of the materiality of her works. So Sarah was mentioning this link with extractive practices. So that's also another way of rethinking ecology or the environment than has been done so far. Maybe that was more like addressing this idea of human and animal relationships, but also putting a little bit more pressure on that. And I'm also thinking about the discussion we had after the panel. So this question that, or this idea that Sandra Reimann was bringing up to bring Horn's work in conversation with Silvia Federici, or the notion of labor that was addressed, that could be, and that Jessica also right now addressed again, really emphasizing certain aspects that have tended to be eluded, but I think that's not really to do with her work, but rather with the institutional framings, be it institution like museums or art history. So her work has absolutely the potential to put some pressure on how we think about it and how we continue thinking about it today.
It's a beautiful image. Thank you for rendering this image of putting pressure. Like it's this contact that never happens but generates a form of soft pressure that is an actual pressure on our brain, being a muscle, being possibly scattered everywhere in our body. Henrik, you wanted to say something?
Yeah, just sort of in response. I mean, also really to say thanks, because the second session really kind of opened a lot of things up to me and also went into sort of a direction that I didn't fully expect, which was super nice. And that's to say, like, there's something that's been on my mind the entire day, actually, that I'm trying to like figure out a little bit, and your session gave language to that, which is this: if you look at a lot of, you know, artists who are working in the late 60s and early 70s, who identify with this sort of, let's say, performance sort of, let's say, discourse, there's often this very sort of classic notion that it fully relies on an engagement with sort of an audience in a live and a sort of, let's say, sort of a present moment, right? And, you know, sort of, let's say, that history is so imbued with this, you know, overbearing notion of liveness and sort of, let's say, a presence and all these things. And like Rebecca Horn's work sits slightly outside of that, I think. You know, of course, there was moments of liveness as well, but we are looking at many of these things on film, actually, and they feel, yeah, that's how we sort of engage with them, especially in the way that you have staged them, actually, here in this show, which is larger than life, you know, like in a very real way, I think. And so I was thinking about this notion of sort of the confrontation and a body meeting sort of another body. And I think the way that you kind of and not you just by yourself, of course, but the others as well, kind of brought it into the possibility of this body coming from an experience of sort of sickness and sort of a crib, if you will. That, yeah, again, it was about not the meeting with another sort of a body, but the threshold of one's own body as a discrete sort of entity almost, and making it indiscrete in so many ways. So I thought that was such a gift. And also there was one other thing that I really took from the second session as well, which was the possibility of sort of breaking down, you know, and it really made me think of these machines. And we talked a little bit about it as well, like, you know, like through museum life, and that will, you know, now happen as well, I think. You know, these machines will be on life support for the rest of their life in a way. And are they allowed to like break down actually? Is that okay or not? It's more a fantasy, but you know, just that.
But it's very intriguing fantasy. It should be also say that looking from a, let's say, art film perspective, the position of Rebecca Horn is also singular towards how she decided to represent via film. I mean, she was definitely performing for the camera, or these were performance for the camera, which back then wasn't necessarily obvious. And performing for the camera means also performing for a machine, right? So that's, but what's behind is a camera. It's not a machine, in fact. So that's an interesting direction that could be perhaps also explored and developed. And maybe this is a question for Jana. I mean, you've been alchemically, as it was meant, as I say, composing the show throughout the years. And how do you see now the exhibition after having been so brilliantly opened up through the eyes of our peers and colleagues?
Yes, thank you so much. I mean, it was a day full of learning. And I would like to go back to the conversation you had with Nick in the very beginning. And Nick was mentioning how the work, Rebecca Horn's work, has the ability to stretch time. And yeah, create this kind of tension, what will happen with the movement. And Nick, you said you cannot find it in kinetic art. Somehow it's more an organ. And that's what I learned. And the very first moment when we installed the exhibition, that was the very moment I could experience her work physically. What does it really do to us? And I brought up this example with the head balance, and it's about the space in between and what she, her work, what it does with us. So I would say in the end, it's energy which connect us, and also to a totality. And I think that's Rebecca Horn work about. And I've learned about the research that it's so much about energy. It's also quite spiritual, and I think this is something beautiful. And she had a lot of doubts about humanity, but somehow she believed in the human being. So that's all very beautiful. Yeah, this is something I take with me.
Thank you. We have 10 minutes, and we have a wonderful audience who made this big effort to stay with us, hopefully passionate. Maybe we can take the opportunity to open up and answer a question you may have. There's one question in the front. Hopefully there's a microphone still available.
Thank you. I just wondered if you would like to speak a little bit about the process, because obviously, Jana, it takes a few years, and then you got to know the artist, and it would be interesting maybe to share how also your view of the work then changed by experiencing, but also in the discussion with the artist herself, and if you can give us some insight on how that all comes together now after all this, the journey. This long journey you made.
Yeah, thank you very much for the question. I mean, there exist so many works by Rebecca Horn. There are so many works with her, with the Munthau Foundation, an hour away from Frankfurt. There are so many works in institutional collections. The question is, you need to conceive an approach which allows you to make a selection of works, and what do you want to tell, and to give an overview of her work, but to maybe give room for the essence of her work and the different strengths in it. So I think that was the challenge, and I was glad that Andrea took me to Rebecca Horn. That Andrea took me to Rebecca Horn 4 years ago, and she happily confirmed that collaboration, and that was a very beautiful moment, which gave us the energy for the coming years. And then there is a beautiful and very important archive of Rebecca Horn, and it includes so many photographs of past exhibitions, and a lot of exhibition views, and you can learn from them how she conceived exhibitions. And that was really important to us. And Andrea was, for instance, Andrea was touching the topic how the performances were conceived, which role the camera played, the editing processes, and so on. And so this archive was our treasure box. And we took it from there.
Well, and I think the show comes at such a fortuitous moment. I think, if you look internationally, it's really a moment when the major shows of sort of artists who have their core in sort of, let's say body and let's say performance work are being historicized at the moment. I mean, at the moment at sort of the Tate Modern, there's a huge sort of Mike Kelly exhibition, who is, sort of, or who was a Los Angeles-based sort of artist who also had his core there. And there's many other examples. And I find it so, I don't know, fascinating almost to see all these different sort of approaches, whilst all these sort of artists, of course, went into their own kind of way with that, let's say, practice. And it's going to be interesting to see how the knowledge of sort of a performance in very different ways, I think, can be held in these sort of exhibitions as something that happened at a certain point in time that cannot always be sort of reached anymore. But the energy, if you'll allow me to use that word, can be held in these shows somehow. And I don't know, I find it also a great example of that. So thank you.
Is there any other question? If not, we are extraordinarily on time. We would like to thank all of you. We would like to thank all those that were here on stage, or everyone who brilliantly navigated through the work of Rebecca Horn. We learned that transmission is a major preoccupation for choreographers, and we hope that this was a first important stage to begin to transmit the extraordinary legacy and rich practice of Rebecca Horn that will be flourishing, we are sure, in the next months, years to come, and will be probably seen from many different perspectives. Thank you once again for pulling together this wonderful afternoon. Thank you.